Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, a forum for integrating the life sciences. Where on the second Wednesday of each month, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to bioscience.oxfordjournals.org. And if you have a chance, please rate us on iTunes, and always feel free to leave us a comment or drop us a line on Twitter at BioscienceAIBS. And for our fourth episode, I'm joined by Dr. Joseph Veldman of Iowa State University. His work is on the threat of forestation in areas that have traditionally been grasslands, and we also get into some of the ways that mapping and policy can threaten ancient landscapes. Now, I know at first blush that might sound like a reversal of what we discussed last month, which was grassland incursion into Amazonian forest. But we cover it in the interview, and it's actually an interesting distinction. So let's get straight to it. Dr. Veldman, thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, thank you. Very nice to be here.
And just to get us started, I think we're all very accustomed to hearing about the importance of forest restoration and forest preservation. But you're talking here about a situation in which we have too many trees and too much tree planting. And it seems as though you're describing a situation in which our conservation priorities are out of order. And I'm just sort of wondering what's going on.
Well, I think that's the current state of environmental policy, and especially in the age of climate change and concerns over atmospheric carbon dioxide. Planting trees would appear to be a really clear approach to sequestering carbon, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And some of our concerns, we address both the biodiversity consequences of too many trees. And too many trees can be caused by intentional tree planting in grasslands, so that's afforestation, or it can happen more subtly through fire exclusion, fire suppression policies, and other land use decisions that promote trees at the expense of grasslands.
And what in particular do we lose when we do that in terms of ecosystem services? What are the big ones?
So preceding our paper, going back about 10 years ago, Robert Jackson at Duke, now at Stanford, published a paper detailing the consequences for groundwater and stream water of afforestation. And that's one of the sort of ecosystem services I think we really forget about, is that you can't eat carbon sequestered in trees. And there's a lot of other things that ecosystems do, services that they provide. One, the provisioning of water that's extremely critical to people who live in grassy biomes. And this is of particular concern in regions that are seasonally dry or where annual precipitation is not particularly high. And then also the biodiversity that is also a motivating factor for many conservation initiatives.
Speaking of the biodiversity, are we seeing a sort of a greater amount of biodiversity in the grassy biomes, or is it more of a situation where it's just a different landscape type, and if we, promote afforestation throughout entire regions, we're going to lose this other type?
Well, so imagine in grassy biomes that the majority of plant diversity is concentrated in the herbaceous plant community. So these are grasses and forbs and shrubs that may only reach knee height, and they focus a lot of their investment below ground because over millions of years they've had to deal with repeated fires, herbivores that are munching them back to the ground. And so over really long periods of times, the species that live in grassy biomes have developed very different strategies than plants that live in forests. And along with that, you have many animal species as well that depend upon these open ecosystems. When I say open, I mean open tree canopy ecosystems, and they don't do well in forests. A prime example would be the mega herbivores of Africa. These are not, wildebeest herds don't occur in forests. These are savanna species, grassy biome species. And so if we think about grassy biomes as ancient, and the species that occur there being dependent upon these frequent sort of forces that reduce above ground biomass but concentrate it below ground, we realize that we're dealing with a biome that is very different than a forest and needs to be managed in a different manner. And in terms of appreciating its biodiversity values, we need to think about them. We need to be thinking about what's going on in this herbaceous plant community and not simply think about how dense is the tree cover.
And in addition to that, one thing I took away from your article, though, is that we're not just talking about any grassland, though. We're talking about specifically the ancient grassy biomes, right?
Right. And I think that this has been actually a real big part of the image problem for savannas and grasslands, is that they've largely been misinterpreted as degraded forests. And some of this confusion comes from the fact that if you take, for example, a tropical forest and you burn it, you cut trees, you introduce cattle, you sow exotic forage grasses, over not very long periods of time, you can get a vegetation that looks very much like a grassland. I mean, it's got grasses, it may have scattered trees, fires may be frequent, but these are ecologically very, very, very different from old growth savannas and grasslands that are part of sort of the grassy biomes that evolved over millions of years and have often persisted in the same places for millions of years.
That's fascinating because, just last month we were talking about, grassland incursion in the Brazilian rainforest. And it sounds like the biomes, the ancient grassy biomes get a bad rap by comparison to those newer grasslands. They're not the same thing.
Right. So, and the work by Jennifer Balch and Dan Nebstad, Paulo Brando that you're referencing is a really nice experiment to try to understand how fires degrade forests and what are those sort of vegetation fire feedbacks and what does that mean for tropical forests. We're really concerned about the opposite dynamic, where instead of fires moving into ecosystems that did not historically burn, we're actually removing fire from ecosystems that did historically burn. Brazil, in particular, where that experiment you referenced is being carried out, is a prime example of this. It shouldn't be a conflict, but we'll say a conflict in sort of, or a challenge to environmental policy, because in Brazil, out of concern over Amazonian deforestation and forest degradation due to fire, they've had policies that made fire illegal even in the Cerrado biome. They're enormous savanna biome in Brazil. And so vast areas of the Cerrado have been lost to forest encroachment, not to mention enormous rates of agricultural conversion.
That's interesting, and it raises something that I think we've talked around a fair amount, but we haven't necessarily drilled down on directly. And that's sort of the policy element of all of this. You mentioned in your article the Atlas of Forest Landscape Restoration Opportunities, and how it had some problematic ideas. And I'm just sort of wondering, where are policymakers getting the wrong ideas, if they are?
I think there's a few things that factor into this. One certainly is perhaps a historic preference for forests in conservation, which is in part somewhat odd in that we think of, for example, influential work by Aldo Leopold that really was influenced by the prairies of the Midwestern United States and their conversion to agriculture. And so even within the field of ecological restoration, restoration has its roots in grassland conservation and trying to get back what was lost due to agriculture. In terms of the sort of carbon policies, I mean, there are many people who are sort of warning about the pitfalls and risks associated with a sole focus on carbon in conservation. And I think that right now, when we look at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the clean development mechanism that's included, that offers essentially would offer money for conversion of old growth grasslands for tree plantations. There's nothing preventing that sort of payment to happen and that kind of ecosystem loss to occur. Back to your question about the Atlas of Forest Landscape Restoration Opportunities published by the World Resources Institute, that map was originally an analysis in 2011 that was intended to determine the global potential for forest restoration. This came out of a concern of mostly tropical forest degradation and deforestation, and trying to sort of figure out where in the world and to what extent would it be possible to promote restoration, mainly through reforestation. And by demonstrating that there was this huge area, it looked really impressive for policymakers in Europe and North America to say, hey, we can get on board. There's a lot that we could do. There's a lot that we could invest in. That map moved from being just sort of a page on a pamphlet to sort of promote commitments to reforestation, to being this online atlas where users could sort of zoom in on different parts of the world and see where these opportunities for reforestation exist. That's where things fell short.
Right. And I hope you'll indulge me for a moment. I want to make sure that our listeners understand the scope of the problem that you're describing. So I'd refer everybody to Figure 2 of your article, and we'll have a link in the show notes. But it seems here that you're describing 9 million square kilometers of grassy biomes that are potentially at stake or at risk from being misclassified. Am I reading that right? Is the problem really that big?
Right. So that's perhaps the scale of the problem with their analysis. We do mention a number of caveats even in our own analysis. I mean, for example, we do not have a good global map of grassy biomes. So if for those that are looking at Figure 2, we know that there are extensive ancient grassy biomes in Madagascar, in India, Southeast Asia, the southeastern United States, northwestern North America, portions of Mexico and Central America, even areas of Europe that are not mapped on this map, which so in purple shows up the grassy biomes. But that was based on a widely used but unfortunately not very inclusive map produced by Olson and colleagues in 2001. So I'll just say that on the one hand, we have real underrepresentation of the grassy biomes globally in this map. The other issue is that there may very well be some deforestation within those areas mapped as grassy biomes. So grasslands and forests often form sort of complex landscape scale vegetation mosaics, and there are certainly some forests that occur in these areas of that are mapped as grassy biomes. So we have a mapping problem.
And speaking of that mapping problem you brought up, what are some of the kind of practical mapping or conservation decisions that we're seeing that may not be the right ones? Say with regard to fire or something else.
Yeah, well, so and that's actually the question of fire, I think, is a really big one, because one of the key things that could be avoided, even if we don't have good maps, is to revise how a lot of countries are thinking about fire. I mean, for example, in Brazil, now in Bolivia, where I work, again, these policies intended to protect forests from fires are really having devastating consequences for the ecosystems that evolved with fire. And in many cases, people doing sort of their traditional land management are actually quite good at maintaining grassy biomes through a combination of fire and, in some cases, grazing animals. What's interesting is that in a lot of places, those policies could be simply making sure that fire is legal, and that people who live in grassy biomes and have been burning them for their entire lives and for generations can continue to do so.
A question. Do you find yourself having difficulty ever, balancing your role as an ecologist, one who's strictly scientific, you're studying these ecosystems, and an advocate? Does that come up in your work?
To me, the bigger challenge is that on the scientific end, I know what I know. I study the things I study, and have a grasp of what others have done on those topics. As I approach the policy end, that's where I'm not an expert in terms of how these things get done. But what I am comfortable in doing is saying, hey, from a scientific perspective, these things look bad. For example, if you impose fire suppression laws in this region, we have a really good idea of what is going to happen. To me, what's frustrating is knowing that I perceive the details of these ecosystems in a way that a lot of people don't, because they haven't spent a lot of time there. And I think that is the challenge with, for example, tree-focused conservation. When we have something that has become sort of symbolic of conservation, like a tree, that kind of oversimplification just really it just really doesn't work in a complex world. And so I hope that what we're doing is trying to sort of raise the awareness of a broader spectrum of ecosystems, a broader spectrum of ecosystem services that exists around the globe. I mean, we have just such a tremendous diversity of different types of ecosystems globally that it's I think that we can do better than just focusing on sort of simplistic conservation symbols.
And I think that's a really good place to leave it. Dr. Veldman, thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, thank you, James. It's been a pleasure.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences. To read the article we talked about today and more, point your browser to bioscience.oxfordjournals.org. Thank you for listening, and talk to you next month.